I need to say something before we go any further, not because it's easy to say, not because it's dramatic, but because if I don't say it now, everything else will sound like performance, and I'm not performing tonight. There is a version of me that the world has never actually met, not the version people think they know, not the version that speaks when spoken to, not the version that laughs at the right moments or nods in agreement just to keep conversations moving. Those versions are real, yes, but they are not me. They are simply the mask that learned how to survive a world that prefers people simple, predictable, and emotionally manageable. The real version of me exists somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper, a place that watches more than it participates, a place that notices everything but rarely announces what it sees. Because the moment you start speaking the truth about what you observe in people, the world gets uncomfortable very quickly. People don't mind being seen, they mind being seen accurately. And accuracy is dangerous. Accuracy strips away the stories people tell about themselves. It exposes the motivations behind kindness. It reveals the insecurity behind arrogance. It shows the fear behind control. Most people don't want that kind of mirror. So I learned something early. You can either be honest about what you see, or you can be accepted by the people around you. Rarely both. And I chose honesty not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, internally. I became the kind of person who watches, not out of suspicion, not out of paranoia, but out of awareness. Because once you start seeing the patterns in human behavior, you realize something unsettling. Most people are not nearly as complicated as they believe they are. Their emotions follow familiar paths. Their reactions repeat predictable loops. Their fears echo the same insecurities that have existed in humans for centuries. It's almost mathematical, and once you see that, it becomes very difficult to unsee it. You start noticing the small pauses in conversations where someone is deciding what version of themselves to present. You notice the shift in someone's voice when they move from honesty into performance. You notice the tiny flicker of discomfort when someone realizes you might be paying closer attention than they expected. That's the moment people begin to feel uneasy around you, because being watched is uncomfortable. But being understood without permission, that's terrifying. So most of the time I pretend I don't see. I let conversations flow. I let people believe their masks are working. I allow them the comfort of thinking their inner contradictions are invisible. Not because I'm kind, but because the truth is exhausting. Imagine walking into every interaction, already aware of the emotional architecture behind it. Imagine seeing the insecurity behind confidence before someone even finishes their sentence. Imagine hearing the unspoken resentment hiding behind someone's polite smile. Imagine recognizing when someone is lying not through evidence, but through instinct. That's what it's like living inside a mind that never stops observing. It's not a gift. It's not intelligence. It's simply awareness without an off switch. And awareness comes with a strange side effect. Isolation. Not the dramatic kind. Not the lonely, tragic version people romanticize in movies. No, this isolation is quieter than that. You can sit in a room full of people and still feel it. You can laugh with friends and still sense it lingering in the background. Because even when you are physically surrounded by others, there is a subtle awareness that very few of them are operating at the same depth of perception. Most people are living inside their own emotional narratives. They experience life through the lens of what they feel. But people like me, we experience life through the lens of what we notice. And noticing too much changes the way you interact with the world. You hesitate before speaking because you already know how your words will land. You hold back truths because you understand the damage accuracy can cause. You measure every response against the psychological ripple effect it will create. And eventually something strange begins to happen. You stop reacting like other people. Not because you don't feel things, but because you feel them after analyzing them. Emotions pass through observation before they ever reach expression. By the time they arrive at the surface, they have already been examined, understood, and partially dissolved. That's why people sometimes call me calm, or controlled, or emotionally distant. But those words miss the truth entirely. The truth is much simpler. I feel everything. I just don't react to everything. Because when you understand the mechanics behind human emotion, reacting impulsively starts to feel unnecessary. It becomes like watching a storm you've already predicted. Yes, it's powerful. Yes, it's intense. But it's no longer surprising. And once life stops surprising you, something subtle begins to shift inside your mind. You become quieter, more patient, more observant, but also more detached, not from people, from illusions. The illusions people build around themselves to feel safe, the illusion that everyone is honest, the illusion that most relationships are based on truth, the illusion that people understand themselves as well as they claim they do. Once those illusions dissolve, you start seeing the world differently. And the world starts seeing you differently too. People can sense when someone isn't operating on the same emotional frequency. They may not know why, but they feel it. They notice the way you watch instead of immediately reacting. They notice the way your silence feels heavier than normal silence. They notice the way your responses seem to arrive from somewhere deeper than casual conversation. And it unsettles them, because most interactions are built on shared assumptions, small talk, surface emotions, predictable responses. But when someone refuses to operate entirely on that level, the social script begins to break. And people don't like broken scripts. They prefer the comfort of familiar patterns, so they label you quiet, intense, mysterious, maybe even intimidating. Not because you're trying to be any of those things, but because they can feel the difference between someone who is simply present and someone who is watching everything. And once people feel watched, they become self-conscious. They adjust their behavior. They start wondering what you've noticed. They start questioning whether you see through the things they hope remain hidden. That's when distance forms. Not because you pushed anyone away, but because awareness creates a kind of gravity most people aren't comfortable standing near for long. So over time, you learn to live with a strange paradox. You understand people deeply, but very few people understand you. You can read the emotional currents moving beneath someone's words, but when you speak from your own depths, most people only hear fragments. Not because they're unintelligent, but because depth requires patience, and patience is rare in a world addicted to speed. People want quick emotions, quick explanations, quick comfort. Depth moves slowly. It asks questions that don't have immediate answers. It reveals truths people would rather not face. And the deeper you go, the fewer companions you find along the way. That's the quiet cost of awareness. You begin to realize that most connections in life are temporary intersections of circumstance. People meet, they share moments, they drift apart. But very few people ever reach a level of perception where they can truly see each other. And when they do, something strange happens. Recognition. Not the kind where you simply understand someone, but the kind where you realize their mind operates in the same dark corridors as yours, where silence carries meaning instead of awkwardness, where observation replaces performance, where two people can sit in the same quiet space and know neither of them is pretending. That kind of recognition is rare, so rare that when it happens, it almost feels unreal, like discovering another person who has also been quietly watching the world from the edges instead of the center. Someone who understands what it means to see too much and say too little. Someone who knows the strange loneliness of awareness. Someone who understands the weight of perception. Because once you see the world clearly, you can never return to the comfort of illusions. And living without illusions changes you. It makes you sharper, more precise, more careful with your words. But it also makes you something else, something most people never notice until it's too late. Unpredictable. Not because you're chaotic, but because you're no longer controlled by the same emotional triggers that control everyone else. You don't react the way people expect. You don't follow the scripts they rely on. You don't mirror their assumptions. And that makes you difficult to categorize. The human mind hates uncertainty. It wants labels, definitions, simple explanations. But what do you call someone who sees the emotional game before it begins? What do you call someone who notices manipulation before it unfolds? What do you call someone who reads the room before anyone else realizes the room is being read? You call them many things: detached, cold, guarded, maybe even dangerous. But the truth is far less dramatic. They are simply aware enough to see the patterns most people never notice, aware enough to understand the silence between words, aware enough to realize that the most honest parts of people rarely appear in what they say, but in what they hesitate to say. And once you learn to listen to hesitation, you start hearing truths no one intended to reveal. There's something strange that begins to happen when you spend too much time observing people. At first, it feels like a skill. You notice things others miss. You recognize patterns before they fully form. You understand emotions before they are spoken out loud. It feels powerful, like you've gained access to a hidden layer of reality that most people walk through blindly. But the longer you live with that awareness, the more the power begins to feel like a burden. Because seeing people clearly comes with an uncomfortable truth. Most of them are not who they believe they are, not in a malicious way, not in a dishonest way, just in a human way. People build identities the same way cities build walls, not to deceive others, but to protect themselves from what lies outside those walls. And those walls become the stories they tell about themselves. I'm a good person. I'm loyal. I'm strong. I'm independent. I'm honest. But when you observe closely enough, you start noticing the cracks in those stories. The good person who becomes cruel when they feel threatened. The loyal friend who disappears when loyalty becomes inconvenient. The strong individual who quietly collapses when no one is watching. The independent soul who secretly fears being alone. The honest one who bends the truth when honesty threatens their image. And the unsettling part isn't that people contradict themselves. That's human. The unsettling part is how unaware most people are of their contradictions. They live inside narratives that feel true to them, even when their actions quietly rewrite those narratives every day. Watching this over time changes the way you interact with the world. You stop expecting consistency. You stop believing words without observing behavior. You stop assuming people know themselves as well as they claim. And slowly, something inside you becomes quieter, not cynical, just realistic. Because once you've seen enough patterns repeat, you realize something important. People rarely change suddenly. They reveal themselves gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. At first, the image is blurry, then shapes appear, then details sharpen, and eventually the truth becomes impossible to ignore. But by the time the truth is visible, most people have already invested emotionally in the illusion. That's where awareness becomes lonely, because you see the photograph forming long before others do. You see the red flags when they are still tiny signals. You see the cracks in someone's character before the structure collapses. You see the inevitable outcome of certain behaviors before the consequences arrive. And when you try to speak about it, people rarely listen. Not because they don't trust you, but because human beings protect their hopes more fiercely than their logic. Hope is comforting, reality is disruptive. So most people choose hope, even when the evidence quietly argues against it. You learn this the hard way. You warn someone about a person they trust. They say you're overthinking. You predict how a situation will unfold. They say you're being negative. You notice someone's intentions shifting. They say you're imagining things. And then time passes, weeks, months, sometimes years. And eventually the pattern reveals itself exactly the way you saw it from the beginning. By that point, people return to you with a strange mixture of regret and disbelief. How did you know? They ask it like it's a mystery, but it isn't. It was never intuition. It was observation. Careful, quiet observation. But explaining that never changes anything. Because observation requires patience, And patience is something most people only develop after life forces them to. Until then, they prefer the easier path, the one where emotions lead and awareness follows behind. People like me operate the opposite way. Awareness comes first, emotion arrives later. And that difference changes everything. It changes how you trust. It changes how you form connections. It changes how quickly you allow someone into your world. Because when you can see the architecture of someone's character early on, you don't need years to understand them. Sometimes you need only a few conversations, a few silences, a few moments where their behavior contradicts their words, and suddenly the entire structure becomes visible. You see what drives them. You see what they fear. You see where they will break under pressure. You see how they treat people who have nothing to offer them. And once you see those things, you can't pretend you didn't. That's the quiet curse of awareness. Ignorance can be comforting. Knowledge rarely is. Sometimes I envy people who experience relationships without analyzing them. People who simply trust. People who simply believe. People who can live inside the emotional moment without stepping back to examine it from every angle. There's a kind of freedom in that. But freedom comes with a price, and that price is vulnerability. People who don't observe carefully are easier to deceive, easier to manipulate, easier to hurt. So the mind adapts. If it has been hurt enough times, it learns to watch, not with paranoia, with precision. It begins to track patterns in human behavior, the way a scientist studies recurring reactions in an experiment. It remembers the tone someone used when they lied before. It remembers the body language someone displays when they're hiding resentment. It remembers the subtle shifts that reveal someone's true intentions long before those intentions become obvious. Over time, these observations become automatic. You're not trying to analyze people. Your mind simply does it. The same way your eyes automatically focus when you look at something, and once that ability develops, there's no turning it off, even when you want to, even when you try to relax, even when you tell yourself to stop reading between the lines. Your mind continues to notice the hesitation, the micro-expressions, the contradictions, the patterns repeating beneath the surface of everyday conversation. Most people never realize how much they reveal without speaking. But someone who lives in observation notices everything. The way someone avoids eye contact when a topic gets too close to the truth. The way someone's tone sharpens when their ego feels threatened. The way someone becomes overly charming when they need something. The way someone becomes distant when they feel guilty. All these signals form a language most people don't realize they're speaking. And once you learn that language, silence becomes incredibly loud, because silence isn't empty. Silence is where the real information lives. It's where people accidentally reveal who they are when they're not carefully managing the image they present to the world. And the strange thing is, the more accurately you read people, the less dramatic they appear. The mysteries dissolve, the confusion fades, human behavior begins to follow understandable patterns, which means fewer surprises, but also fewer illusions, and illusions are what make life feel magical for many people. Without them, the world becomes clearer, but also heavier. You start realizing how many relationships exist because of convenience instead of connection. How many friendships survive because no one looks too closely? How many people stay together not because they truly understand each other, but because they fear starting over? These realizations don't make you bitter. They make you selective. Selective with your time, selective with your trust, selective with the energy you invest in others. Because once you understand how people work, you stop chasing quantity. You start looking for rarity, and rarity is difficult to find. Genuine self-awareness, emotional honesty, intellectual depth, the ability to examine one's own flaws without defensiveness. These qualities exist. But they are not common. Most people spend their lives defending the image they have of themselves. Very few spend their lives investigating it. And those who do, they become different, quieter, more reflective, more comfortable with silence than noise. because noise is where people hide. Silence is where people reveal themselves. That's why I pay attention to silence, not just what people say when they speak, but what appears when they stop speaking. The hesitation before an answer, the pause after a difficult question, the subtle tension when someone realizes they are being understood more deeply than they intended. Those moments contain more truth than entire conversations. And if you live long enough paying attention to them, something fascinating happens. You start recognizing other observers, people who live the same way. They are easy to spot, not because they stand out, because they don't. Observers blend into environments. They listen more than they speak. They study the dynamics of a room before participating in it. They choose their words carefully. They rarely waste energy on meaningless noise. And when two observers notice each other, there's a quiet recognition. No dramatic conversation, no obvious signal. Just a subtle awareness that the other person is also watching, also listening, also seeing the patterns beneath the surface. It's like meeting someone who speaks a language most of the world doesn't even know exists. And in that moment, something rare happens. You don't feel like the only person standing outside the illusion anymore. You realize someone else has been watching too. There's a point in a life built on observation where the focus begins to shift. At first, you watch other people, their behaviors, their contradictions, their patterns. You study them the way someone studies weather, tracking emotional storms before they arrive, recognizing the pressure changes before conflict forms. But eventually something unsettling happens. Your attention turns inward, and that's when observation becomes dangerous. Because most people spend their lives examining the world around them. Very few people spend time examining the machinery of their own mind, not the comforting parts, not the stories they like telling about themselves, the deeper mechanisms, the quiet impulses, the hidden fears, the motivations that exist beneath the explanations we give for our behavior. When you begin observing yourself with the same precision you use on others, the illusions inside your own identity start to dissolve. You notice things. The subtle ways your mind protects you from uncomfortable truths, the way your ego quietly edits memories to preserve a flattering narrative, the way your thoughts sometimes react to emotion before logic has time to intervene, and the strangest realization arrives slowly. You are not entirely in control of yourself. Your mind contains layers. Some of those layers are conscious, but many of them operate quietly beneath your awareness, influencing decisions before you realize a decision was even made. Once you see that, it becomes impossible to pretend you are the fully rational being you once believed yourself to be. You begin to see your own contradictions, moments where your behavior didn't match your values, moments where your emotions distorted your judgment, moments where your reactions were driven by wounds you thought had already healed. It's humbling and slightly terrifying, because if you're capable of misunderstanding your own mind, what does that say about everyone else? Most people avoid this realization. They distract themselves. They stay busy. They fill their lives with noise, not because they're shallow, because silence forces introspection, and introspection forces confrontation. Confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that the human mind is not a perfectly organized system. It's a labyrinth. A place where memory, emotion, instinct, and logic collide in ways we don't fully understand. But people like me can't ignore that labyrinth. Curiosity pulls us deeper. We start examining our reactions, our fears, our desires. We start asking uncomfortable questions. Why did that comment bother me more than it should have? Why did I trust that person even though the signs were there? Why do certain memories still carry emotional weight years after they happened? Each question leads deeper into the maze, and the deeper you go, the stranger things become, because eventually you discover something unsettling. The mind doesn't just observe reality, it creates it. Your perception shapes what you believe the world is. Two people can experience the exact same event and walk away with completely different interpretations. because their minds filter the experience through different histories, different fears, different beliefs. Reality is not just what happens. Reality is how the mind interprets what happens. Once you realize that, you start questioning everything, not in a paranoid way, in a philosophical way. You begin to wonder how much of what you believe is actually true, how much of your identity is authentic, and how much was constructed through years of social conditioning. How many opinions you hold because they are genuinely yours, and how many you absorbed simply by growing up in a particular environment. These questions dismantle certainty, and certainty is something most people rely on to feel stable. Without certainty, the world becomes more complex, more ambiguous, but also more honest. You stop pretending there are simple answers to complicated human experiences. You stop believing that people can be neatly divided into categories like good and bad. Because once you've studied the mind long enough, you realize something profound. Human beings are capable of incredible kindness and terrible cruelty. Sometimes within the same day, sometimes within the same moment, we are not single identities. We are collections of impulses, memories, fears, and intentions that shift depending on circumstance. That realization changes the way you judge people. You become slower to condemn, but also slower to trust, because you understand how fluid human nature really is. Someone who behaves admirably today may reveal something darker tomorrow. Someone who seems difficult at first may reveal surprising depth later. The mind is too complex to reduce anyone to a single story, including yourself. That's the part most people never reach. Self-awareness, real self-awareness. Not the superficial kind where someone acknowledges a few obvious flaws. The deeper kind where you examine your own darkness with honesty, the anger you suppress, the jealousy you deny, the pride that quietly influences your decisions, the insecurities that shape your behavior in ways you rarely admit out loud. Facing those things requires courage, because once you see them, you can't pretend they don't exist.